The South African Union of Students is accusing some universities of failing to protect students. The organisation says it looks like South Africa has two higher education systems as it navigates its way through the COVID-19 pandemic. This, it says, is made worse by ineffective governance in higher education. Let's talk more about this then. We're joined by the Union of Students spokesperson Thabo Shingange by Skype. Thabo, afternoon to you. Good to speak to you. So let's start with examples then of institutions which, in your view, aren't protecting students during this time.
Good afternoon, Tembegile, and to the viewers of eNCA. Thank you very much for having us. I think to shoot straight into your question, it's the issue around, for instance, Fort Hare University, which you would recall the last time we had actually even spoken about this. Fort Hare was experiencing a number of challenges even at the beginning of this year in January alone. The same challenges continue to plague that institution, such that on the 3rd of August, the university has failed to even convene to start the academic calendar for the year. Meanwhile, the University of Pretoria, by contrast, for instance, began with its second semester today, which then for us speaks to this two-tier higher education system where your most historically advantaged universities, VETS, UP, UCT, etc., are continuing to the second semester, whereas your most disadvantaged have not even started the academic year. What does that then say about a single coordinated system as enshrined in the Higher Education Act?
And interesting that you say that, because at the presentation of the higher education plan, it appeared that the department and the respective universities had a grasp of some of the differences, socio-economic and otherwise, spread across the country's tertiary landscape. Why do you think it's now apparently, by your account, fallen apart?
Look, I think if we go back to the initial conversation around online learning, for instance, you would see that the push has by and large come from historically advantaged universities relying on their vast resources, which went ahead and bought laptops on their own accord, provided dates on their own accord. If you recall, it was the likes of VETS, the likes of UJ, which initially had given students the 30 gigs advancements and the laptops in that regard, therefore setting the pace and tone of what was to be then assumed to be a standard position of the higher education sector in terms of continuing the academic project online. Whereas a number of historically disadvantaged institutions have been found wanting or really playing catch-up to the pace that has been set by these particular institutions. And now that we're in August, for instance, it's proving more and more challenging for these institutions to even meet some of these particular regulations that have been agreed in the ministerial task team, to say that even 33% of the student body must be allowed back to your campus. You have some institutions, for instance, which are failing to even adhere to that alone, having pushed back the start date to as far as September in the case of Walter Sisulu University. And we're saying that these are some of the examples that speak to the growing challenges in the sector, made worse, of course, by the inability of the ministerial task team to convene fundamental meetings over the last 8 weeks alone to speak to some of these critical issues and provide much needed coordination. That is where, as a union, we locate the absence of effective governance for the sector as a whole, which then in effect results in institutions operating in adverse silos.
What explanation has been given to you as far as to why these meetings have not been convened?
Look, as the union, we've written a letter to the chair of the task team, initially inquiring about, the failure to commit to the weekly meetings as previously agreed upon, failure of getting a response within that particular platform. We have a union has escalated and written a letter to the minister registering these particular concerns. But more gravely for us, I think it speaks to the broader implications of student activism that have been presented, or the limitations towards student activism presented by the demobilization of students and the positions that we find ourselves in. Many students across institutions, SRCs for instance, are failing to get the student voices being heard, and due to the demobilization are just merely being ignored, and the growing challenges being ignored or being masked by these online, or replaced by these online formalities. And we're saying that even the tendency to ignore these concerns, the protests that are happening online, for instance, that are being ignored, speaks to some of the broader challenges around what does it mean then in the post-COVID era around student activism and meaningfully engaging students around issues that affect them and them directly. Instead, we're being pushed to the sidelines with universities continuing ahead in the name of saving the academic project, and yet the students, the most vulnerable and poorest of the poor, are being left behind, or even offered things like leave of absence in the name of finishing the academic project. To make an example, there's a student at the University of Pretoria, and I've spoken to the mother before this, Asamahle, for instance, who is struggling due to some of the challenges presented by NSFAS concerns around SARS data showing SARS issues coming up. Those students are not being assisted in terms of funding when the government responds, what we call the missing middle challenge. Those students are not being responded to effectively and are being left behind. No one is speaking to these issues, yet we are saying we're saving the academic calendar online.
So is the year then as good as lost for students such as Asemahle?
Look, the reality is that at this continued pace, we're going to be leaving a number of students behind and a number of Asamahles that we do not know of in this particular regard. What we're calling for is for effective coordination of the sector. We're calling for the Minister of Higher Education to convene an urgent meeting to stabilize the sector. I mean, even his previous utterances were suggesting that the 2020 academic year might go as far as March 2021. But if you are having, for instance, your universities of Pretoria, your universities of Johannesburg continuing with the second semester today, it shows you that the intention is to perhaps even complete the 2020 academic year in 2020. What does that then mean? It's a contrast of university positions, it's a contrast of ministerial utterances, and therefore leaving the students completely in isolation and in confusion, and them being negatively affected by this particular lack of coordination and effective engagements.
Thabo Shingange from the SA Union of Students, thank you for your time this afternoon.